On the 15th of July 2026, history was made when more than half of the Democratic Party voted in the United States Congress to stop all aid to Israel. Measure did not pass because all Republican Party except one single Kentucky congressman, Thomas Massie, voted against the bill. But the die has been cast till a few years ago something like that was simply unexpected. Democratic Party was always considered a bastion of support for Israel. Not anymore. Ferocious debate about what happened in Gaza, perceptions of genocide and the rise of social media that provided a platform for that debate has changed consciousness all across the United States. And Democratic voter base, being more diverse, is profoundly affected by that change. This rejection of aid for Israel came within 24 hours of the Democratic Party in the US Senate, stopping the passing of National Defense Authorization Act, thus blocking of US $1.15 trillion for Pentagon. Democrats wanted clarity on Iran war at a time when President Trump has again started his war on Iran, and no one knows how this will end. To discuss all this, plus a growing schism between Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio on Iran, and how Pakistani community can bring back the congressional focus on Pakistan, Moeed Pirzada is joined by Erik Sperling, Executive Director, Just Foreign Policy in Washington. Please join this channel and Moeed Pirzada's Patreon page to support this brand of informed journalism. Given the crackdown by governments on social media, this work is only possible with your direct help.
Unprecedented historic vote in United States Congress, where more than half the Democratic Party has voted to stop all aid to Israel. Erik, what is really happening?
We're in a new era where this entire mass killing of tens of thousands of women and children, not to mention innocent civilians, was broadcast to the whole world. This has led to a major generational shift, really with young people, but also with Americans of all backgrounds, I think for two different reasons. Israel's in an increasingly precarious situation. They have a demographic problem where they're increasingly, obviously, an apartheid state. This was the most extreme mass killing that Israel had to do in one single war since its founding. More than 100 Democrats say, I don't just want to put restrictions on Israeli aid. I will take a vote to cut $3 billion, the entire $3 billion. Pro-Israel, forces that both U.S. and here and in Tel Aviv, they got to be pretty worried.
What's your final assessment? That Trump wanted to get out of the war?
He didn't have a political benefit for getting out, but I think the two options were to either go essentially nuclear on Iran with the genocidal attack.
Do you have a nuclear attack on Iran?
J.D. Vance has a pretty clear view. He wants the U.S. to get out of the war and focus on America. Marco Rubio has a very clear view, which is that he wants to regime change Iran, continue the U.S. presence in the Middle East, and he wants to expand it over to the Indo-Pacific.
So how do you look at the role being played by Pakistan, the Field Marshal, the Army, the Shahbaz Sharif in Iran-US talks?
It's just been a transparent effort to shore up their legitimacy. Trump's never been able to say the Field Marshal's name a single time that we've seen on camera, by the way. So this is not a very deep relationship. That the current Pakistani regime is fighting for its life. They're going up against the country's national hero, but you'll notice they do keep Shahbaz Sharif around in every picture. And it's almost becoming funny. Remember the guy? The earliest one was that funny businessman who came and was going to invest in real estate.
Beach country.
Yes, that guy. Yeah, remember that one? The reason why Imran Khan's position on Russia was so threatening to the US and to Donald Lu and to Europe.
Assalamu alaikum, this is Moeed Pirzada in Washington. Joining me in the session is Mr. Erik Sperling, who is founder and executive director of Just Foreign Policy. This is an institute in Washington that maintains a close liaison with the Congress and monitors the development in Congress. And the context for today's discussion is that just a few hours ago, there has been an unprecedented historic vote in United States Congress, where more than half the Democratic Party has voted to stop all aid to Israel. That is unprecedented. That is historic in the sense that, given the special relationship between the United States and Israel, since the 1967 war, no one could imagine the Democratic Party, that has often been accused of being the biggest supporter of Israel in the United States, is now so split on the relationship with Israel. So I would start exactly from this, and then I'll come to other issues. Erik, what is really happening?
Yeah, well, what's happening is, I think what many of your viewers likely know, is that we're in a new era where this entire mass killing of tens of thousands of women and children, not to mention innocent civilians, innocent men, was broadcast to the whole world. And so Israel, traditionally they rely on on the mainstream media, whether it's CNN, or other entities in the United States. And I think in Pakistan, your viewers know well, mainstream press there, it was much easier to control. But now with the advent of TikTok, that's been a major focus, which is why you saw such pressure on TikTok. And the proponents of the TikTok ban explicitly said it was because of the way that information that harmed Israel's image was passing. So, this has led to a major generational shift, really with young people, but also with Americans of all backgrounds, I think for two different reasons. One of them is just that in general in America, whether MAGA or whether, progressive human rights focused, people do not want to be talking about this foreign country of Israel. That's just a strange thing. People want to hear about their day-to-day lives. And so when a politician's saying we got to protect Israel, Americans increasingly find that very off-putting and very troubling. It's, why are you talking about such a small country over there? They might be fine, but I want you to talk about here. So that's number one. And then number two, you see, of course, the American younger people, including Jewish Americans, are totally, on the left side of the debate now, in more joining kind of what Europe, closer to what Europe was more historically. So it's very interesting.
Very interesting. Even the Jewish Americans.
Oh yeah, I mean Jewish Americans. I'd say there's major camps. Obviously, there's those Jewish Americans that remember very well the Holocaust. Maybe they're maybe their grandparents or parents, or maybe they came over from the Holocaust. That still exists. But then as you get younger, I think more and more Jews are, and this is widely shown in all the polling, that Jewish Americans are not feeling. Younger Jewish Americans are not feeling the same connection to Israel, and they're certainly not willing to stand by while a genocide is committed in their name. And then more recently, you're seeing Jewish Americans of all backgrounds saying, Netanyahu and this extremist government in Israel is harming Jews because it's making associating Jews with that kind of killing. And so there's different camps. Some Jews would say, and I don't really want the Jewish state to exist in this way anymore. I would like a state with mixed. Other people would say, well, I like the Jewish state, but I want it to not be with Netanyahu. And then other people, of course, just support Netanyahu. But the first two groups are growing, certainly.
But the second thing, which is very interesting, you said that it is because of the growth of the social media platforms. So you think that the American legacy media had controlled the consciousness of the American people. They would not fully understand in all the past 30, 40 years. They would not really understand what is really happening in Middle East. They would always think that Arabs and Palestinians are perhaps the main villains and Israelis are the victims. Is this what was really happening?
It was part of it. I mean, I think, for a period after World War II, people, of course, it's pretty natural. I mean, sure, all of us, I think everyone probably to some extent is concerned, whatever one thinks about, exactly what happened. The idea of gas chambers, the idea of, Anne Frank, the idea of, persecution of the Nazis was in some ways quite traumatic. And so I think there was a lot of leeway given because of that. And so I think that's part of it. The other part of it is that Israel's in an increasingly precarious situation. They have a demographic problem where they're increasingly, obviously, an apartheid state. My former boss, Ro Khanna, was just in the occupied West Bank and just experienced, as many of your viewers may have seen, was detained by settlers, violent armed settlers, and the IDF. But Israel increasingly has that problem where, because of the population differences, it's increasingly obvious that it's an apartheid state. And so, and then, so then that's the other part of it is, this was the most extreme mass killing that Israel had to do in one single war since its founding. And so I think that doesn't help either. But, in the sense that it's hard to cover up such a horrific mass killing, even if they did have a control. But with TikTok, it was beyond impossible. So that's the situation. And so I think Israel's in a very tough place. And to see more than 100 Democrats to say, I don't just want to put restrictions on Israeli aid. I will take a vote to cut $3 billion, the entire $3 billion.
3.3 billion.
3 billion.
3.3 billion. 3.3 billion.
Yes, exactly. 3.3. And that's what Obama negotiated in his 10-year plan there. And so it's a pretty significant moment. That said, I think those of us who are in this space and who are, we want to still find ways to translate this into real consequences for Israel. This was a huge symbolic win. but critical now to figure out strategies.
But Eric, it brings us to a very interesting question about the American politics. Why the Democrats? Why only one Republican, Thomas Macy, who actually introduced the bill, has voted for the bill, and none of the other Republicans has voted for the bill. So why this change is spreading across the Democratic Party, not in the Republican Party?
Yeah, well, I would say the Republican Party still, first of all, it is a slightly older party, and it does have much stronger base of hawkish, kind of neocon. If you watch Fox News, your viewers may turn it on. I mean, this is extreme hawkish, pro-war, pro-Israel viewpoint. By the way, there's also this huge component. It's not just Jewish Zionists. It's a group of Christian evangelical Zionists. So your audience may or may not be familiar with these people, but they believe that Israel has to do some sort of killing, and Jews have to do some level of killing and control certain levels of territory in the Holy Land in order to, for Jesus to return. And then some of them say that 144,000 of the Jews will get to go to heaven with the other believers, but no more. So this is fundamentalist religion on the Christian side that is actually a huge part of what's supporting Israel in the U.S. right now. So, and even though they don't actually believe the Jews they're supporting will really go to heaven with them. So it's really quite a twisted dynamic.
But why the same kind of dynamic doesn't exist on the Democratic Party?
Well, so certainly there's pro-Israel money on the Democratic side. And so that does exist. It's more pushing for the two-state solution, and we could get a little bit into the strategic vision that people have for the region and how those differ. But the bigger thing is just that the Democratic Party is more diverse. It's the party that has people of color in it, that has the Muslim community is technically is supposed to be represented by the Democratic Party in many cases. And so I think it's more susceptible to that type of pressure that can balance out and start to kind of balance out some of the donors, though it's still unclear how far it'll be able to go.
So what will be the impact of today's vote?
So the impact of today's vote is that, this has been, I think everyone in, say, the U.S.-Israel national security community is trying to approximate and trying to get their best sense of how deep is this going to go? I mean, how long are people going to keep, focusing on the U.S.-Israel relationship? Where is the bottom? And how can we kind of get this out of the headlines, get young people to focus on something different? And I think that the vote today, because of the way that it happened, where I think initially people thought it would get 20 or 30 votes, and then there was some estimates were higher, but the way that it happened, I think that, the pro-Israel, forces that both the U.S. and here and in Tel Aviv, they got to be pretty worried. They're worried. People may be following. There's a Senate race in Michigan. AIPAC is dumping in, I think the record-breaking amount of money into that race. And so they're basically responding at this point by testing the upper limits of how much you can fund an election and see if you can counteract. They don't run a single ad on Israel, by the way. They're talking tens of millions of dollars in ads. Not one ad is saying our candidate supports Israel.
Really?
Types of disturbing things, because if they would say anything about Israel, they think people would just vote for the other person. So,
but at the same time, the AIPAC has been able to eliminate many anti-Israel kind of voices, like Thomas Macy himself from Republican Party. How do you look at this?
Yeah, it's definitely going to be district by district, and I think, this is something that is exactly what these high-paid lobbyists and experts on the pro-Israel cause are assessing, which is how many districts are going to be impacted by this. Can we retain 50% or 2/3 of the districts in the pro-Israel camp, enough that we can, limit, this problem? And so I think it's going to come down to what happens generationally. Is the trend in Republican young people opposing Israel? Does that continue? And then we have, still in America something, here that's obviously the silent generation, and then the boomers, and those groups are by far the most pro-Israel groups. And so, I think there is a push from those who are more savvy to try to figure out a new arrangement with Israel, a new strategic vision for the Middle East before that generational shift happens and it gets prematurely cut off entirely.
Another thing also happened in the last 24 hours. The National Defense Authorization Act was stopped in the Senate by the Democrats, actually. What is the significance of that?
Yeah, so as obviously you've been covering, that we've had this horrific Iran war. My organization, Just Foreign Policy, was founded back in 2006 to oppose the Iran war, and we've been as a staffer in Congress. I mean, this has been a focus the entire time. And finally, Israel lobby, working with Trump's allies, got Trump to do this war. So Democrats have been pressured, and over time, they've actually been able to pass an unprecedented vote, which we supported, which said, you must end this war. You have no authority to do this war. This has never happened in this way before. But unfortunately, Trump is pretty lawless. He didn't look at that important congressional mandate where the directive to end the war. He disregarded it. So Democrats are now looking for ways to enforce that. They are trying to block. This is the defense bill, the NDAA. They're trying to block the defense bill. And we're also working with members of Congress, people on the outside, to bring a legal court case to take the administration to court to force them to end the war. So
for how long the Democrats can stop the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act bill? For how long?
Yeah, that's the question. They could, in theory, stop it indefinitely, most likely. The problem is that the truth is, and this is sad, I think, for many people, is that there are some very hawkish Democrats. In theory, what we've been calling for is the Democrats to say, we're going to stop up all your must-pass legislation. We're happy to pass it, but for now, we're not going to pass any of it until you get back to the negotiating table and you sign a deal that ends this war. Because this war is illegal. The American people don't want it. Just need to get the deal done so we can be done with this. But unfortunately, there are going to be some number of Democrats who are going to make probably excuses because they don't really want Trump to sign that peace deal with Iran, is our fear. Or they may make some other excuse, but our fear is, believe it or not, some of these Democrats are they're not dying to help Trump get out of the war. But that's what we're calling for. They should block up any kind of national security legislation until he gets to the table, signs a deal.
So, but Erik, I'm a bit confused over here. So help me and my viewers understand this thing. When the MOU was signed and Trump signed this 14-point MOU, I saw that the position of many in New York Times, the columnists and the politicians and the media people, who I thought that were basically against the war, it looked as if they didn't even want the war to end, and they were more against the Trump rather than against the war. So what's really happening?
Yeah, that's a very astute observation, because this is exactly what has been happening. So, our groups and the Democratic and progressive and anti-war base, a lot of Pakistani Americans are part of that. We've all been pressuring, saying, Democrats, force him to end this war. And they've done it over time. But then when he comes to make the deal, I mean, I've been publicly criticizing people, including some of the worst have been, I know you have some people in Jersey. Senator Booker has been terrible on this. Senator Chris Murphy in Connecticut, and there's a lot of Pakistani Americans up there. These people, they've been terrible. And what are they saying? They're saying this is a surrender. This is a humiliating surrender. What an embarrassment this deal is. What a loss for America. And then they say, but I think he should sign it, though. I think he should go forward. It's a humiliating, embarrassing defeat. But I think he should sign it. But really, what are they trying to do? Well, they're trying to, I won't speak to their motivations, but what is the impact of what they're doing? The impact of what they're doing is to close political space for that deal, to make it even harder. So when Trump signs that deal, we have not only Republicans on the right saying, Trump, this is a terrible deal. You have Democrats saying this is a humiliating deal. And so it's a very troubling dynamic. I think the most cynical view would be that these are hawkish Democrats who want him to have to keep hitting Iran, and they don't want Iran to get a fair deal. A slightly less cynical view would be that they're just trying to score partisan points. And I guess, third view is they're not very knowledgeable, because the reality is that it's not a humiliating deal or a loss for America at all. We actually lose absolutely nothing. All we do is we stop.
No, but there is if I can slightly disagree with you. I mean, from an American point of view, Strait of Hormuz was open to the whole world before the war. What has Donald Trump achieved? If Iran actually gets to dominate and dictate and decide the issues on the Strait of Hormuz, then the United States and Trump is worse off then where they started the war.
But the Strait of Hormuz, Iran would easily relinquish that if the U.S. simply made a deal that was a really trustworthy deal, that the hostility was really going to end, that this was really the final period of hostility, and that there was going to be a new relationship. So the Strait of Hormuz is their backup plan. It's when they say, hey, if we can't trust the deal with the U.S., which it's very hard to trust the deal, because not only did they rip up the previous deal, Trump ripped up Obama's deal, but he attacked Iran twice during negotiations. So they have very little reason to trust. So the Strait of Hormuz is kind of their insurance policy. But if there was a deal where Trump said, Trump could make the case, if he had the right state of mind, look, these hostilities with Iran have been a disaster. The better path is going to be negotiations and diplomacy. Let's make a deal. And then Democrats would get behind and say, all right, we agree as a country, we're going to put hostilities behind us. And Iran could really trust that. It would take some trust building. But they would easily relinquish the Strait of Hormuz in exchange for peace and sanctions relief and asset.
But can Trump create such a consensus in the American political system between the Democrats and Republicans that, look, we need to have, it's better to have friendly Iran on our side rather than a hostile Iran?
No, probably not. Trump he's not smart enough, unfortunately. He's, he may have had the right intentions, but he's not understanding the dynamic here that the American people really don't care about hostilities with Iran. If you poll them, someone asks them, do you think Iran's a threat? Someone American might say, yeah, Iran, I've heard of that. That's a threat. Yes, it's a threat, because they've heard it for 47 years. But it's not a top 100 issue for any American family, really, other than the very Middle East focused, certain hawkish, Jewish families, basically, and some extremely hawkish.
It's an Israel issue. Iran is an Israel issue.
Yeah, that's clear. So, it would be possible to do. J.D. Vance is someone who's been trying to do it. People may have seen today, J.D. Vance was on Joe Rogan, and a couple of the clips that were most significant was him talking about the way that the Israeli funded and Israeli government was undermining his negotiations. And so...
Oh, he said that?
Yeah, he said that. And this is a big deal. And it'll get some more play in the coming days because, this is exactly what we knew was true. J.D. Vance, a lot of people have reasons to not like him. But one thing that is definitely not, huge problem with him is that he's definitely the most pro-diplomacy, least hawkish vice president on the Republican side, arguably ever. And so, depending on how you measure it. And so, J.D. Vance could get it done, but it brings us back to what you're saying, which is, those of us in our movement, we need to make sure these Democrats can't go on TV and say, this deal J.D. Vance negotiated for peace, what a humiliating embarrassment. They should be ashamed that they're such, failures. That said, we support the deal, which is what they've been saying. So that's our next task.
But no one really welcomed the deal. I think, if you look at Professor, what is his name? The Chicago professor, Pape, John Pape, right? What is his name?
Robert Pape, yep.
Robert Pape. I always thought that Robert Pape was taking a position against the war. But the moment the very moment that Trump comes to close some sort of deal on Iran, Pape is the first one to basically say that Iran has won. It's a humiliating thing. Look how Iran has defeated the United States. And no president and no presidential team can afford to hear this kind of rhetoric. So these people who are apparently anti-war are not really helping to close the war deal. But do you think Trump wanted to end the war? What do you think? When Trump signed on to it, when he was actually in Europe, in France somewhere, he basically had his electronic signature affixed to the deal. Do you think he was sincere or he was also playing for time?
Well, I think that gets to the big unknowable question that the whole world and historians will forever wonder, which is why did he launch this war in the first place? This is the number one thing that is epitomized what he was supposed to be against. Obviously there are many theories about, the type of pressure he was under to do it. It makes no sense. But, putting that aside, yeah, he wants to end the war. He wants gas prices to come down. He wants to be able to refocus on things that Americans want. But what he's not able to do is essentially end the war in a way that the Adelsons, who gave him, I forget the number, I think it was
Miriam Adelson, $300 million.
Yeah, it was, yeah, exactly. These are not just people who funded his campaign. These are people that could bankroll him over the course of his life. When he gets into trouble. So he doesn't want to end the deal on terms where they say, Donald, all this you did was for less than nothing. You've ended it on worse terms than you started. So that's, I think, the big thing. That said, if there was an outpouring of support, if there were right-wing anti-war people and progressives who said, Trump, get it done. If you get this deal done, we'll support you in this narrow way of ending this war, and we're not going to stab you in the back. And Ro Khanna, to his credit, of course, has been one of the few members saying that. But it's not enough when the whole chorus... And I just looked at, by the way, YouGov polling data. So progressives and Democrats are the highest supporters for a peace deal as soon as possible. But in the same poll, they asked them, so what do you think about the peace deal that was signed? They have the lowest support. One in three or one in five of the Democrats support the
contradiction.
Deal. So it's because of the way this has been messaged, and that's so. In other words, you nailed it on the head, and we need Democrats and others to show good faith, to not try to score political points or trap Trump into the war, so that we can get him out of this, because he isn't a very competent and thoughtful guy.
So what's your final assessment? That Trump wanted to get out of the war and couldn't get out of the war because of the resistance?
Yeah, I mean, there wasn't the political, he didn't have a political benefit for getting out, because, between the fact that his patrons, in terms of the pro-Israel lobby, they didn't want him to sign that deal. And then.
So why he signed the deal then?
Well, because I think, as you recall at that time, I mean, prices were on the verge of getting out of control, and they were struggling to find a way to contain that. So that was going to go catastrophic. So I think in that certain sense, everyone agreed that something had to be done. But I think the two options were to either go essentially nuclear on Iran with the genocidal attack, to just go full genocidal. And certainly a lot of, Fox News people supported that for sure.
To have a nuclear attack on Iran?
Or just to have a intentionally and escalatingly, brutal attack on civilians over time.
Carpet bombing of Iran?
Yeah, it's essentially what he was hinting at. If you recall the infamous statement, we've all forgot, but he said he.
No, his statement was this, that he's going to destroy civilization.
Yeah.
So Trump, then, will it be right to say that when he signed the deal, when he affixed his signature on the deal, J.D. Vance was probably sincere to the deal, but Trump was looking to find more time to prepare for the next attack? No,
I don't think Trump has, there's not a lot of evidence that Trump has very sophisticated views about how these things are going to play out. He's more of an opportunist. J.D. Vance has a pretty clear view. He wants the U.S. to get out of the war, get out of the Middle East to some extent, and focus on America and American problems. And Marco Rubio has a very clear view, which is that he wants to regime change Iran, and he wants to continue the U.S. presence in the Middle East, and he wants to expand it over to the Indo-Pacific, if you will.
No, but this is very interesting. I wanted to come to it. Is this Marco Rubio's foreign policy position a sort of an intellectual position, or is this because Marco Rubio is trying to align himself with the Zionist lobby, his trip to Middle East after J.D. Vance, and J.D. Vance is trying to align himself with the MAGA movement, Make America Great Again, America First, the Christian side? I mean, there's some sort of split between Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance. Both are presidential candidates to 2028.
Yeah, that's one way to put it. I mean, this is the biggest split in the history of in the modern history of the Republican Party. I mean, these are two polar opposite visions, with Marco Rubio, who is, the biggest, traditional U.S., great power strategist. He wants to take on China and defeat China and Russia. And he's been that way since his first term. He was his very first term in the Senate. He was one of the most vocal proponents of the Libya regime change war, which turned out to be an absolute nightmare, just a total failure in every way. Whereas J.D. Vance is very much someone who, is seen as a very big threat to even the transatlantic alliance. He's not very committed to it. He really is much more of a traditional isolationist, certainly one of the biggest isolationists we've had at that level in modern history. So this is the biggest split that there could possibly be, and whoever wins this division is going to be, Marco Rubio is going to have, it's totally ideological for him. And he has the entire national security apparatus of the U.S. behind him. But J.D. Vance likely has a bit more of the middle-aged and younger base of the country with him. So it's going to be quite a battle in that sense. Trump's never been able to say the field marshal's name a single time that we've seen on camera, by the way. So this is not a very deep relationship. That the current Pakistani regime is fighting for its life. They're going up against the country's national hero, but you'll notice they do keep Shahbaz Sharif around in every picture. And it's almost becoming funny. Remember the guy? I mean, the earliest one was that funny businessman who came and was going to invest in real estate.
Beach country.
Yes, that guy. Yeah, remember that one? The reason why Imran Khan's position on Russia was so threatening to the U.S. and to Donald Lu and to Europe.
So how do you look at the role being played by Pakistan, the field marshal, the army, the Shahbaz Sharif in Iran-U.S. talks?
Yes, this is something we've studied a lot, and from our perspective, it's just been a transparent effort to shore up their legitimacy. Clearly they don't have any economic...
Their legitimacy. So it's Pakistani regime is trying to fix its own legitimacy.
Try to fix its own legitimacy. I mean, it's just so obvious. For those who follow Pakistan at a basic level, they have no economic theory of change. They have no, there's not even any personality, to the officials. They really are struggling to find even a way to kind of explain what their purpose is. When we know, people who know it know what the purpose is that it's a clique of elites that are essentially, parceling up, what remains of the state there, and giving it away over time. And it's just so transparent, but they've done quite well. And unfortunately, this is where Marco Rubio, we've seen, I'm sure your viewers have seen the pictures of him with the quote unquote supposed field marshal, in the Oval Office. Marco Rubio is thrilled because he knows that he's managed to get Trump to buy in on the field marshal and to remember who the field marshal is. Trump's never been able to say the field marshal's name a single time that we've seen on camera, by the way. So this is not a very deep relationship. But
it's not a very deep relationship, but after every 10 days or 15 days, the American president, for the first time in 200-year plus history, appreciates a sitting general in a country. I don't remember, I'm just like yourself. I'm a very keen student of the American history. I don't remember any American president since the American Revolution has ever welcomed a sitting army officer of another country in White House for a lunch, or has been mentioning him like Field Marshal, my favorite Field Marshal. Have you ever seen that?
No, of course, the past U.S. presidents were more sophisticated, where they knew that they're supposed to pretend that the civilian government was in charge, because that's how they justified the relationship, when they knew they were just obviously had a relationship with the brutal military dictatorship. But that was obvious. But the idea was you pretend that the civilian government is your counterpart, and then that allows you to keep up the fiction, the fiction you're trying to create. But because Trump is obviously so unsophisticated, and Rubio, was aware, just like all your viewers are aware, I'm aware, Rubio is also aware that the current Pakistani regime is fighting for its life. They're going up against the country's national hero, best athlete, who started the cancer hospital. This is obviously the biggest existential fight they've ever had since the founding, as far as I think my understanding. So, so he was desperate to make that connection with Trump. And so they were saying, whatever it takes, Trump likes strongmen, let's just connect him with the strongman. But you'll notice they do keep Shahbaz Sharif around in every picture. And it's almost becoming funny. I mean, it's like every picture, Shahbaz is there. It's almost humorous, but even the media coverage. So I will say, for your viewers, one of the benefits of this, the downside is, of course, for now, it's bought the regime some time and this perceived legitimacy from Trump. But the upside is that the U.S. media has now dropped the pretense of the civilian government. Everyone's reported it's Asim Munir, the most powerful man. So that's one upside. The other upside is Trump actually isn't that popular in Congress and isn't that popular with Democrats. So by choosing a side, the Pakistani regime has taken a pretty risky gamble. And so they're going to have to do a pivot soon and say, no, actually, we are not aligned with Trump. And it's, of course, going to be our community in the pro-democracy human rights community in the United States that says, no, this is Trump's favorite field marshal, and we need to cut all U.S. weapons to Trump's favorite field marshal.
But Eric, what makes you think that the Pakistani military is not investing at the same time into the other side? I remember by the end of 2024, when the election happened, the Pakistani military was very worried by any kind of change of guard in White House. They were very worried what would be Trump's position on them if the Trump won the election, especially because the Pakistani American community had made such a song and dance, Maybe even they didn't have much of an access to Trump team, but they created a perception that, the Trump team has promised to them something about Imran Khan. And then they hired a Texas-based lobbyist, Stephen Payne, who then connected them with the other sides of the Trump team. And then you found out that within a few months, by the middle of the 2025, they had, something like 5 or 6 major lobbyists, all close to Trump. And also Michael Kurela, the outgoing CENTCOM chief, helped them in bringing the Sharifullah, the useless person, which they blame for the Abbey bombing in Afghanistan. So the Pakistani military knew that they need the support from Washington. They were worried about the Pakistani American community. You were working with the Pakistani American community. So they invested into the Trump team, and they found what is this name, Witkoff, and his son, Zach Witkoff. So I think they are smart enough to be investing on the other side as well. In case the sides flip and the Democrats come into the power, they would be investing into the Democrats. I mean, what if they are not investing into Newsom?
No, without question, they're going to try. That goes absolutely without saying. The good news is that the Trump situation has so many transactional people that it actually worked out pretty well for the Pakistani, for the Asim Munir regime. That's really the ideal situation because it's a very traditional regime. It's not that sophisticated, actually. It's one of the more. I mean, it could be worse, but they have some sophistication. But by and large, they work the best when they could simply pay someone. Remember the guy? I mean, the earliest one was that funny businessman who came and was going to invest in real estate.
Beach country.
Yes, that guy. Yeah, remember that one? How did that? Does anyone follow up how that investment worked out? By the way, I haven't looked.
No, nothing happened. I don't think if anything happened on that. But even the company he was founding, he also had some sort of access. He was also one of the college mates or university mate with one of the Trump sons.
No, I mean, I think their development should be finished construction by now. So let's see if we can locate where that development happened. And and I'm sure that just like the rare earth mineral development that they promised Trump is starting. So this is just really low. This is kind of, by Washington standards, this is pretty pathetic stuff. If it didn't have Rubio to usher it through, I don't think Rubio is unbelievably sophisticated guy. Disagree with him more on I don't think anything. Honestly, he's just.
But what is Rubio's interest in the Pakistani military?
I mean, he's just an unbelievably sophisticated and strategist essentially, and he's can be unbelievably strategic in terms of kind of laying low and not fighting every fight to be able to fight the next one. This is a prime example. I mean, because in the view of these people, I'm sure your viewers may know this, but the reason why Imran Khan's position on Russia was so threatening to the U.S. and to Donald Lu and to Europe, and I agree with them about this assessment. I disagree with that they have the right view, but is that if Imran Khan maintained an independent position towards Russia and towards China and towards Iran, you essentially are going to have a block of 4 major countries that have an independent foreign policy that would be far too much for the U.S. It interferes with the U.S. regional plan in a way that is basically fatal for the plan. And so Rubio understands this. If you get Imran Khan come in right now at age, maybe 73, I hope only?
74.
Well, it's still young, 74, I believe. But if he comes in at 74, 75, and then oversees the next 10 to 15 years, directly or indirectly, takes Pakistan into a multipolar camp, in the views of these people, that is absolutely fatal for U.S. Global hegemony. And so Rubio knows that, and that's why he cares, in my opinion.
So what can the Pakistani American community do to change the perceptions in Washington?
Yeah, so the perceptions, first of all, I just need to be clear what the Pakistani American community did, and with working with others. I was very proud to work with so many people, but it was already absolutely historic to go from zero to what we were able to do in that time as a broader movement. There was so much strength. They brought Donald Lu in. I remember you and I talked when they brought him in for the hearing. They thought they were going to crush the pro-democracy movement in the U.S. with that hearing. That was their goal, but we were able to prepare for it. We were able to actually grill him, and he left more stressed. Donald Lu left that room more stressed than when he walked in, which was not his plan. And then you saw that Washington had to develop multiple pieces of legislation that appeared to be supportive of democracy, human rights, but were actually meant to slow the community down. and to kind of give the community something.
Like what? Give some examples.
Well, the initial plan, if you looked at the original...
You're referring to the Joe Wilson bill.
That was one. There was 3 to 4 rounds of this, actually. And I just want to be clear that they would never do that if they didn't perceive what the community was doing as an incredibly potent and powerful movement. That is really incredible what happened. So we could get into those bills, but essentially
in Urdu language, we have a term which is called as truck ki batti. That means taking someone behind the lights of a truck. There's an 18-wheeler truck, and you just keep on following the 18-wheeler truck, which is not necessarily taking you to a destination. So in Urdu, it's called truck ki batti, to basically mislead you, to take you in the wrong direction. So you said 3 or 4 or 2 or 3 pieces of proposed legislation were actually truck ki batti.
Yeah, I mean, do you think, do the CIA Pakistan officers know that term? Because if they do, then they're probably the ones who told, who worked with Stephen Payne and Joe Wilson to do this. And, it's understandable because, as a human being, I remember you've told me many times, if we tell them the story, they're going to understand but unfortunately, U.S. power is so advanced that they have mechanisms of control where you could tell the story, they can say they care, and then they can still find a way to not take action. And so, it's very understandable that people, let's use the latest example, which was HR 5271, okay, which was introduced by Huizenga and Kamlager Dove, which is the Democratic chair and top Democrat on the Pakistan subcommittee of the House Foreign Affairs. Okay, this bill looks really great if you look at it, but if you read the text, it has a lot of optional language, and you find the only operative part. The operative part, it says the White House must produce a classified report within 6 months. So a classified report. So I just, as an expert who works on legislation, I've never even heard of legislation that does that little in my entire life. That is the weakest legislation. And they actually sold that to the community as if it was a major accomplishment. If they had said, hey, this is very weak, but we're going to move it right away. We're going to get a floor vote. We're going to create a lot of energy and excitement, and then we're going to move to the next step. I would say, okay, that's reasonable. But they did the exact opposite. They introduced a classified report dressed up as something more. And what are they doing with it? They've stalled it. They're not even moving it. Okay, so the very simple thing that the communities we're going to get to do, we hope that the pro-democracy movement in Pakistan stays strong. Because as long as that movement stays strong, then what we're going to get to do is turn up the pressure in a very serious way by demanding that our friends do legislation and actions that turn up the pressure on the U.S.-backed regime there.
So I need to understand 1 or 2 points over here. So you're saying that there are smart people inside these lobbies or attached to these Congress people, or someone is guiding them to exhaust and drain the resources of the Pakistani community by misleading them through these pretentious, false pieces of legislation, the proposed pieces of legislation, that even if become acts, do not achieve anything. And in this particular case, they haven't really been approved either, right? So, but the Pakistani community has been sponsoring, financing these legislatures with tens of thousands of dollars in the hope of achieving something. So that means the Pakistani community in the first instance has to develop a more sophisticated, because you like the term, the sophisticated understanding of the congressional process. So they have to understand the pieces of legislation. They also have to understand the liaison and the connectivity of the various congressmen as to where they're coming from. I mean, what kind of ideas they hold, who are their support bases, who are their funders and donors, what is their relationship with CIA and with the deep state. So I think, am I right in making this understanding?
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. I mean, I think at the most basic level, the community just needs to, I think we've seen a lot of wonderful meetings, a lot of nice photos, a lot of actions, but I think, and this action is happening. I'm working with a lot of amazing Pakistani American leaders on this now, and to sketch out, what does a real plan to turn up the pressure look like? And we're not talking about anything that interferes in Pakistan's internal affairs. We're just talking about the support that the U.S. government is giving to prop up that regime. And so, Pakistani regime will pretend this is about sovereignty, when we know that's not a concern of theirs, but that's what they will say. And so we need to be clear. We're just talking about, we're not going to train a military that's, repressing people, jailing people. We're certainly not selling any arms. We're certainly not going to, and then we need to look at kind of the financial relationship and whether, the U.S. is subsidizing elites that are essentially engaging in corrupt practices.
But my last set of questions. A short while ago, you said that if Imran Khan comes back even at 75 and he manages or influences the Pakistani politics for the next, say, 5-10 years, then there could be 3-4 different kind of power blocks, and they are antagonistic to the United States perception of power. Marco Rubio has a sophisticated view of the American power, and so on. But my fear is this, that if the perception is this, that a democratic change in Pakistan is necessarily against the American interest, then the American system is never going to like a democratic Pakistan. I would actually like a democratic Pakistan that can align with American foreign policy interests in some way. Maybe there is a change of perception, change of heart within the United States, that a democratic Pakistan being led by a politician like Imran Khan, maybe not Imran Khan, but someone like Imran Khan, is not necessarily hostile to the interest of the United States. A democratic Pakistan can befriend India, can actually move away from the Chinese power. Maybe a democratic Pakistan can be more useful to United States in the long term. Can we achieve this perception emanating from Pakistan?
Well, when I say about what the U.S. interest is, what we're talking about is the perceived interest of a tiny group of elites that really very few people in America know about and don't support. I'm talking about the national security establishment. And these are not people that have ever requested any particular democratic consent from Americans, or they don't ever explain why what they're doing benefits Americans. It's sort of, well, America's number one, then that's good for America. But they never explain how that actually, trickles down to the, 99% of people, right? So I think I want to be clear that I think that you don't have to acquiesce to them. They're not all powerful. They're actually pretty incompetent. They're getting, it's not my. I don't have a dog in this fight in a certain sense, but they're getting completely smoked by the Chinese national security people. I mean, who are much more thoughtful and much kind of deeper and more long-term plans. And so, I think that there is that option. You can try to appeal to them, but I think ultimately they're never going to trust Imran Khan, unfortunately, at this point. He's too much of an independent actor. Even if he wanted to give that impression, they wouldn't believe it at this point. What you have to do is you have to win. In my opinion, my theory is you have to basically win your liberation as a people in a certain sense. And that requires, defeating the U.S.-backed elite that's essentially been installed over you and that is essentially being maintained with that U.S. political, military, and economic backing. And once you liberate yourself from them...
But the US elite has such deep penetration into the Pakistani political and administrative system. I mean, first of all, through the military, by controlling the military. They also control the financial lobby, the banking lobby. The US supports the IMF. The US is behind the World Bank. The US is behind the Asian Development Bank. The US is behind the European support of the GSP Plus to Pakistan. The US is behind British UK aid to Pakistan. The US is behind the Saudi and the Emirati help and support to Pakistan. So, for Pakistan to get rid or to extricate itself from these kind of deeply penetrated influences looks very impractical to me in the short term and maybe in the long term.
Well, I think it certainly is a challenge. That's the challenge I think Imran Khan faced when he was in office, was striking that balance. But I think it's actually, that balance and the way he sought to strike it was by extending in a multilateral kind of diversified approach, which he did, and I suspect, and you're the expert on this, but he did it, I suspect, in some ways out of desperation from the economic financial situation. But it's exactly that level of that response where instead of simply just kind of mortgaging yourself to the West and say, whatever you all need, we'll do it. He says, no, I'm going to get out of this a sovereign-minded way. That's exactly the kind of thing that they're afraid of. And so, I think it would be challenging. Obviously, that was the challenge he faced. That said, I think it's, I think China would be in Russia would be more inclined to be supportive than they probably were in the past, depending on how it played out. In any case, I think it's a challenge. There's no question about it. I think freeing yourself from one of these U.S.-backed elite groups that's kind of Western tied is not easy. A lot of countries in the Muslim world haven't done it yet. A lot of countries around the world have not done it yet.
But do you think that in the changing political kaleidoscope of United States, someone like Imran Khan can also find support within the liberal left of United States, some of the academics, some of the Congress people? He could engage people like Bernie Sanders, Jeffrey Sachs, and the others. I mean, maybe they can have more understanding. The American system can have more understanding of where Imran Khan is coming from.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. The second this movement, breaks him out of there one way or another, he's going to be, and this is again gets to the reason why the U.S. was not inclined to let him stay in that position, because he's a force. I mean, this is obvious to anyone who's followed him. So, the second he gets out, part because of the growth in the Pakistani American community, the amount of outreach they've done. I've been in countless meetings with people explaining who Imran Khan is. People to understand in Congress who he is. So the second he gets out, I think it'll be a very different picture. I'd say the first time he was in, because of American ignorance about international affairs, there wasn't much knowledge of him, So I think it would be very different. He'd be able to get support from Democrats and Republicans. I think this is the last gasp for that particular clique at the top. But the question is, how long are they going to be able to keep that grip? And it's heartbreaking to see from the outside, because it's so obvious as an outsider that this is a regime that has no theoretical future. There's no theoretical path. The question is, how long can they hold that grip over the people before this country finally gets to flourish? And that's
for how long? Exactly. For how long? For how long they can continue with this unnatural system of control on 250 million people? Exactly. Erik, thank you so much. I greatly appreciate your time at this time, and thank you so much, and I look forward to staying in touch with you.
Thanks so much. Great talking.